This is Tuçaltan, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Chamber of City Planners of Turkey and the organizational team of the 44th Colloquium celebrating the 8th of November, World Urbanism Day. So happy World Urbanism Day, everyone. The team has put together quite an amazing program, actually. And today we have Professor Erik Swyngedouw here with us. And the title of his talk is Life and Death in the Urbicene, the De-Politicized Fantasy of the Anthropocene Urbanization, quite a title, actually. As a big fan of urban political ecology, as you can see, I'm quite excited and happy to be hosting this session by Professor Swyngedouw. He doesn't need much introduction, actually, for the followers of urban studies, but I'll still give you a bit of a brief introduction. So first of all, having a background in agricultural engineering, urban planning, and geography, and also having this very theatrical presentation style, he's kind of the embodiment of how interdisciplinary and even transdisciplinary our field is. Professor Swyngedouw has written on a multiplicity of topics, and he has written quite a lot. His earlier writings on the production and politics of urban space, neoliberal urbanization, and large-scale urban development projects have provided the Turkish readers with an angle to understand and interpret the drastic changes that has been taking place in the large metropolitan areas of Turkey within the last 2 decades. Following those, him and his fellow colleagues have actually created a moment in urban theory by bringing the nature back in the discussion. So to very simply actually put, they defined urbanization as a process that produces, reproduces, and transforms nature. And they pointed that this very transformation is political and discursive in nature and takes place in various scales, and they dealt mostly with the local one. But today, Professor Swyngedouw is going to be talking about a much broader process and scale, namely planetary urbanization. So the talk, having this super interesting title and including the word obscene, which has an obvious sexual connotation in it, us, the audience, we are very much wondering how the obscene and depoliticized fantasies of the Anthropocenic age is shaping our current urbanization processes and at the same time, the everyday lives of people. So I'll soon be giving the floor to Erik, but before that, I would like to make a few tiny technical reminders. First of all, we are live on Zoom in English and live on YouTube in Turkish. Thank you, our translators. You don't have an easy job today, actually. So, and all of both of these broadcasts are going to remain on YouTube. Secondly, now that we have Professor Swyngedouw with us, you can directly ask your questions through the Zoom chat or Q&A. I'll be following them, and my friends are following the YouTube comments section. So please do ask your questions, leave your comments. However, please do this during the presentation. Do not wait until the end of the presentation, which would make it much easier for us to moderate this online session. So without further ado, I'd like to leave the Zoom floor to Erik. So see you in a bit.
Many thanks indeed, Jules, for this wonderful introduction, and also many thanks to the organizers, not just for extending the privilege to speak to you all, but also for the amazing technical achievement. I'm sitting in Amsterdam, and I don't know where you are all sitting, but it's quite an extraordinary achievement to make this happen in these strange COVID times. So my thanks for that. As Jules said in her introduction, I'm interested in the relationship between urbanization, nature, and politics. And it's really this kind of configuration that I would like to talk about to you today for about 40-45 minutes or so. I'm going to start my PowerPoint presentation because I do think it helps a bit to follow the flow of my argument if you can see the storyline as well as some images. So I'm going to share my screen now. I hope all of you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Thank you, Joel. So, as many of you know, we allegedly now live in a new geophysical era, which is generally referred to as the Anthropocene. And I've replaced here the famous Hollywood entrance scene with the welcome scene to welcome us all to the Anthropocene. Of course, as the image at the bottom suggests, the Anthropocene structure of the world is very much organized in and through urban networks, urban flows, and urban dynamics. This image below is basically a representation of urban networks and urban dynamics. What I want to talk about is life and death in the Urbicene. And by that I mean that I want to propose the Urbicene as a more appropriate name to define our current epoch. I think it's somewhat better than the Anthropocene. I'll come back to that. And the subtitle is The De-Politicized Fantasy of Anthropocenic Urbanization. So of course, the first thing that I need to do is to define what I mean by obscene, because as Jill suggested, it has a deeply sexual connotation. However, I would like to use it in the way in which it was etymologically emerging. The word obscene comes from the ancient Greek word skene, skene of the scene of the theater. And in ancient Greek tragedy, for scenes in the play that were deemed too sexual or too violent or too disturbing, these scenes were actually played off the stage and narrated so that the public could actually not see it, but was nonetheless acutely aware of the uncanny, hidden and deeply emotive dynamics that were going on off the scene. So obscene refers to that we know is actually there, but prefer not to talk about, or which we prefer to keep hidden. It's in that sense that I'm going to argue that the debate on the Anthropocene, or the Urbicene as I would call it, actually hides in its underbelly a set of disturbing dynamics. And one of those disturbing dynamics that I'm really interested in is how the debate over the Anthropocene, or more widely, the environmental conditions in which our cities find themselves, that is in itself the depoliticizing the process. So the structure of my talk is in five parts. I'll say something about the Urbicene first, then I'll explore briefly the epistemological and theoretical foundations and framework that is mobilized to think about the Anthropocene/Urbicene today, to then argue how much of this argument is in fact a depoliticizing argument, one that is structured around what I would call an immuno-biopolitical fantasy. To then, in the fourth place, to try to make a case for the need to recenter the political, or to think, again, much more centrally, the place of the political in the Urbicene. So, as I just said, in this presentation, I shall mobilize the Anthropocene, or better, the Urbicene, as the popularized term to denote a new geological era during which humans have arguably acquired planetary geophysical agency. Earth scientists who coined the term Anthropocene now overwhelmingly understand the Earth as a complex, non-linear and indeterminate system with multiple feedback loops and heterogeneous dynamics in which at least some, by no means all, but some human activities are an integral part of these terraforming processes. Think of, for example, climate change, or think of, for example, plate tectonics as an influence by big dam construction, etc. That is, humans, or at least some humans, are now co-constructing deep geophysical time of the Earth. Now, I'm going to suggest that planetary urbanization, that is urbanization at a global scale, as it is structured by capitalist socio-ecological dynamics, is of course the geographical imprint, the geographical configuration of this Anthropocenic dynamic. Nurturing the process of planetary urbanization, and think of Istanbul over the past 20 years or so, nurturing the process of planetary urbanization was and is indeed predicated on intensifying proliferations of metabolic vehicles in the form of socio-technical intermediaries that etch the transformation of non-human stuff in myriad socio-ecological metabolic relationships that order and reorder the way in which humans interact with non-humans, and it does so in radically uneven or unequal socio-ecological manners. Think of, for example, how dependent the economies that animate much of contemporary urban social and cultural life in the global north in particular, such as IT networks, social media, Zoom meetings like the one we're having now, smart networks, eco-architecture, big data informatics, and the like, that all of these deeply urban processes are predicated on mobilizing a range of rare earths, like Columbine tantalite, on feverish resource grabbing, often through tactics of dispossession, in socio-ecologically often very vulnerable places, like in Africa or in Latin America. And is predicated on production chains that are shaped by deeply uneven and often dehumanizing socio-ecological production processes. It's only through that sort of networking that that stuff becomes useful in urban ITC hardware and in a variety of other urban practices. And ultimately, think of your mobile phones, for example. Ultimately, these are being recycled in a process that returns much of the e-waste upon which, let's say, for example, smart cities are based. E-waste is recycled in the socio-ecologically dystopian geographies of places like Mumbai or Dhaka. These are the kind of urban scenes where the recycling takes place of the extraordinary IT materials and equipment through which you and I and most other urban people organize their everyday life. The capitalist form of planetary urbanization and the socio-ecological and political economic processes that animate its combined and uneven socio-ecological catastrophe on a world scale are now generally recognized as key drivers of anthropogenic climate change and of other socio-environmental transformations such as biodiversity loss, soil erosion, the effects of large eco-infrastructures like dams or energy plants, deforestation, ocean acidification, resource extraction, deep geological mining, pollution, and of course the galloping commodification of all manner of natures. Consider, for example, that 80% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions are produced in and by cities. So our urban fate and nature's transformations are irrevocably bound up in an intimate and intensifying metabolic but highly contested symbiosis. The configuration of this urban metabolic relationship that drives so many of the world's ecological problems has now been elevated to the dignity of a global public concern, as deteriorating socio-ecological conditions might jeopardize, as we're being told, the continuation of civilization as we know it. Indeed, a global urban intellectual and professional technocracy, us planners and urban specialists, has spurred a frantic search for a smart socio-ecological urbanity and seeks out the socio-ecological qualities of urban eco-development, retrofitting, sustainable architecture, adaptive and resilient urban governance, and technologically innovative eco-design. That has become the dominant staple of much of urban planners and planning experts around the world. These techno-managerial dispositives that search for an eco-prophylactic remedy for the predicament that we are in have now entered the standard vocabulary of both governmental and private actors and have now been consensually established as the frontier of architectural planning and urban design theory and practice. And these technologies and interventions are presumably capable of saving both city and planet, while assuring that civilization as we know it can continue for a while longer. So my contention is that under the banner of radical techno-managerial restructuring, our focus seems to be now squarely on how to sustain capitalist urbanity so that nothing really has to change. So here are some of the kind of images that are associated with this techno-managerial fantasy of a green, sustainable, and socially just city. The proliferation of these prophylactic socio-technical assemblages to make the urban sustainable and resilient coincided, theoretically speaking, with the emergence of a radical theoretical ontological shift articulated around concepts like non-linearity, complexity, contingency, risk, and uncertainty. In addition, theorists in both the social sciences and the humanities mobilized these new earthly cosmologies, these new insights in the natural sciences, to propose new materialist perspectives and more than human, as they're called, ontologies that point towards grasping earthly matters in a more symmetrical, human, non-human, if not post-human constellations. I shall argue in this talk that the post-human ontologies and their associated cosmologies, their worldviews, in contingent articulation with the new signs of radical uncertainty, nonlinear dynamics, and non-deterministic feedback loops have become an integral part of the proliferating techno-managerial efforts to sustain and support further the galloping year process of capitalist planetary urbanization. Those perspectives can be mobilized further to deepen what I shall call in a moment the immuno-biopolitical governance arrangements that mark the present conjuncture. In the process, I would argue the matter of ecology is fundamentally depoliticized. So the Anthropocene/Urbicene argument not only fully recognizes the active role of humans in co-constructing the Earth's deep geohistorical time, but also, so they claim, inaugurates, opens up the possibility for a new ontological framing of the relationship between humans and non-humans. This symmetrical relational ontology, which is variously referred to in the literature as more than human or post-human, or object-oriented ontology, fuels, so it seems, the possibility of formulating a new cosmology, a new and more symmetrical, if not benign, ordering of socio-natural relations. Nonetheless, and despite its radical presumptions, I contend that these cosmologies also open up the specter, albeit by no means necessarily so, for deepening particular capitalist forms of human, non-human entanglements, and that they can be corralled to sustain the possibility for the hyper-accelerationist, eco-modernist, eco-modernizing, and ultimately eco-gentrifying vision and practice in which design, science, planning, geoengineering, and terraforming technologies, together with big capital, join to save both Earth and Earthlings, but does so in highly uneven socio-ecological manners. The geosciences, and in particular Earth systems experts, discern in the advent of the Anthropocene, Urbicene, the possibility, if not the necessity, for the careful, adaptive, and resilient massaging of the totality of the Earth system. The recognition of the Earth as an intricately intertwined but indeterminate socio-natural constellation opens up, or so it seems, the possibility that the Earth and its cities, with loving supervision, intelligent crafting, careful techno-natural nurturing, and ethical manicuring, that it can be terraformed in manners that may actually sustain the deepening of eco-capitalist processes. Here is Paul de Crutzen speaking, Nobel Prize winning chemist, and also the person who coined the concept of the Anthropocene. He says the Anthropocene will require appropriate human behavior at all scales and may well involve internationally accepted large-scale geoengineering projects, for instance, to optimize the climate. As Bruce Brown insisted in his dissection of the historiographies of these new materialisms, the parallel between non-deterministic geoscience, resilience studies, and the varieties of new materialisms are not too difficult to discern. Indeed, in this staging of the good Anthropocene, that is, we can manage it, the new symmetrical relational ontology that is being proposed can function, I would argue, as a philosophical quilt for sustaining and advocating accelerationist, hyper-modernizing manifestos, such as the Eco-Modernist Manifesto, for example, or the work by the Breakthrough Institute. To save the world, to save our cities and ourselves, we need not less capitalism, but a deeper, a more intense, and a radically reflexive form, one that revolves around reconstructing DNA and genetic material, that mobilizes the power of the nuclear, if need be, to drive the economy and to save it from overheating. So covering up the contradictions of capitalist eco-modernization, the apparently revolutionary new materialist ontologies offer new storylines, new symbolizations of the Earth's past and future that can be corralled to help perform the ideological groundwork required. In the next section, I shall try to show how this perspective enters the field of politics, that is the governing of things and people. But it does so, I'm going to argue, in troublingly depoliticizing manners. As I just suggested, some of the Urbicene, Anthropocene narratives, storylines, provide for an apparently immunological prophylactic against the threat of a hitherto presumably irredeemably external and revengeful nature. So in what ways can the mainstreaming of what appears to be critical and radical new ontologies, whose explicit objective was and is the unsettling of modernist cosmologies, be understood? How can this Gothic be accounted for? I would argue that Roberto Esposito's analysis of biopolitical governmentality, enhanced by Frederick Neyrat's psychoanalytical interpretation, may begin to shed some light on this. Esposito's main claim expands on Michel Foucault's notion of biopolitical governmentality as the quintessential form of modern liberal state governance, by demonstrating how this 19th century biopolitical frame today is increasingly suited by an immunological drive. That is a mission to seal off the objects of government, the population, from possibly harmful intruders, from recalcitrant or destabilizing outsiders that threaten the biohappiness, if not the sheer survival of the population, so can guarantee that life can continue to be lived. Think of some of the COVID-19 actions undertaken by states. Immunological has to be understood here as the suspension of the obligation of mutual communal gift-giving, a form of asylum that suspends one's obligation to participate in the rights and obligations of the commons, of the community, of the polity. The neoliberal injunction to enjoy individual freedom and choice is precisely the founding gesture of such an immunological biopolitics. That is, the ring fencing of the individualized body from its insertion in the obligations and the violence that bonds community life. As Roberto Esposito argues, the more humans, as well as ideas, languages, and technologies communicate and are bound up with one another, the more necessary preventative immunization as counterweight becomes, until it is the coagulating point of contemporary life. Planetary urbanization is such a deeply interconnected process that deepens the drive for immunitary biopolitics. Immunobiopolitics are clearly at work, for example, in hegemonic Western practices around immigration, health, or international terrorism. A rapidly expanding arsenal of soft and hard technologies is put in place in an ever denser layering of immunological, technical, infrastructural, digital, and institutional legal dispositives, from tighter immigration laws, big data profiling systems, and continuous surveillance, to the actual construction of steel and concrete walls and barriers, and the proliferation of all sorts of camps and other militarized enclosures. Similar examples can be identified in the strict cordoning off when infectious diseases, COVID, avian flu, etc., threaten to spatialize in manners that could penetrate the immuno-engineered ecotopian, from utopian, ecotopian bubbles of the elite's local life. Is it not the case that much of the urban sustainability, resilience, smart technologies, and adaptive eco-managerial policies and practices that populate urban planning and ecological interventions are precisely aimed at reinforcing the immunological prowess of the immune system of the body of the body politic against recalcitrant, if not threatening outsiders like carbon dioxide, waste, bacteria, viruses, refugees, jihadis, financial crisis, and the like, so that life as we know it can continue. As Pierre-Olivier Garcia put it, an immunitary power takes control of the risks, dangers, and fragilities of individuals to make them live in a peaceful manner while obscuring any form of dissensus. Alain Brossat calls this a fantasy of immunitary democracy. For Brossat, this is a dangerous fantasy, as the immunitary logic entails nothing else than the destruction of community, of being in common, of politics. Necessarily, he argues, the immunitary logic creates the continuous production of the exposed and the exiled, that is the non-immunized ones, the dying ones, illegal refugees, undocumented migrants, those who have no access to clean water, health facilities, etc., as the flip side of the immunized body, basically my body. And this process, Brossat argues, leads to de-politicization. As Maria Kijker puts it in a quote recently, the immunized, that is those who dwell in the ecotopian bubbles of more or less sustainable, but definitely affluent urban life. The immunized become mere spectators of the suffering of others from the cocoon of their sanctuary spaces, from which only hatred of the other or the distant compassion with her suffering appear as flip sides of the same immunitary distanciation. Of course, as Frédéric Neyrat insists, the immunitary dispositif does not really function, as the exposure to risk affects all, albeit not all to the same extent. In relation to refugees, biosecurity, or economic financial collapse, the immunobiopolitical gestures customarily succeed in translating risks and fear of collapse and disintegration onto a terrain of a crisis to be governed or the situation to adapt to. However, the immunobiopolitical dispositif of crisis management is rapidly disintegrating in the face of the really existing combined and uneven socio-ecological catastrophe that marks the Urbicene. With respect to our socio-ecological condition, the standard eco-technologies of neoliberal governance, which nurture the immunobiopolitical desire that Esposito points to as the primary logic of neoliberal governmentality, becomes increasingly ineffective. Few believe, and do you believe, for example, that a 1.5 Celsius degree threshold for global temperature rise, which is set by the international community, will be achieved? Do you really think that zero carbon urbanity is possible? I doubt it. Is it indeed not the case that the immunobiopolitical managerial tactics of urban system governance, geoengineering, urban adaptation technologies, and other urban eco-governance arrangements leave an uncanny remainder? Or are we not left with the gnawing feeling that despite the elevation of the urban ecological condition to a global public concern, that the socio-ecological indicators and parameters keep on eroding further? The environmental, immunological, biopolitical masquerade secures at best a palliative for temporary relief. As Roberto Esposito argues further, the immunobiopolitical dispositif turns ultimately indeed into a thanatopolitics of who should live and who should die. In the excessive acting of the immunological drive, the dispositif turns against what it should protect. The construction of urban eco-bubbles and urban sustainable enclaves for the privileged produces simultaneously the unprotected exiles and deepening socio-ecological destruction elsewhere. Think of, for example, of the uneven geographies of our mobile phones, the example I started off with. This is indeed eco-gentrification elevated to new heights. In other words, the mechanisms that permit to make and secure life in some places end up threatening its very continuation elsewhere at all geographical scales. Becoming resilient and adaptive is indeed the ultimate hysterical act, to which the only sane response is, stop calling me resilient. Because every time you say, oh, they're resilient, that means that you can do something else to me. I very much like this mural, which was painted by an American artist, Tracy Jackson, on the Lower Shankill Estate in Belfast, a very iconic place in the war, the Civil War in Northern Ireland. And it is the urban, I would argue, where this immunological technomachinery is both experimented with and rolled out. The outsider that threatens the integrity of our socio-spatial matrix, nature as we knew it, is duly brought within an ontological frame that now opens up the possibility for its total incorporation. Such phantasmagoric staging of the Urbicene, the Anthropocene, depoliticizes the matter of nature. We can, or so it seems, survive and do so without the necessity of facing political actions and facing radically different political choices. It seems that a shift in the techno-managerial apparatus sustained by a form of more than human cosmology will suffice. So while the controversies over the Urbicene and Anthropocene are mobilized in all manner of ways, suggesting indeed that there is a debate, a politicization of the stuff of things, I would argue that the political cannot and should not be grounded on the eventual truth of the Urbicene. There is no code, there is no injunction, there is no ontology in the Anthropocene that can or should found a new political or politicizing ecology. The ultimate depoliticizing gesture resides precisely in letting the naming of a geosocial epoch or an ontology of the non-human decide our politics, thereby disavowing that the owl or the human does not exist. It is yet again a failing attempt to found a new politics on a contested truth of nature. It is indeed surprising that radical post-foundational political thought is rarely articulated with more than human ontologies and the way we manage our urban environments. Indeed, the intellectual landscape that brought into conversation complexity theory and the new materialisms, and that claims to open up radical new possibilities, is symptomatically silent of radical political thought that has emerged alongside and in a comparable context. Jacques Rancière, for example, understands, and I would agree with him, understands the political as the interruptive staging of equality by the part that has no part. The political, according to Rancière and associates, appears when those that are not counted within the count of the situation, that is the excluded, the mute, the exposed and exiled, make themselves heard and seen, that is perceptible and countable in staging equality. For these thinkers, the political emerges as an immanent practice of appearance, as Hannah Arendt would put it, or as Alain Badiou would call it, as an event. It's a practice of appearance, an event that interrupts a given constellation, a given socio-ecological order. This performative perspective of politics needs no grounding in any current or historical order or logic based on, say, nature, ecology, race, class, abilities, or gender. The political is a public affair, understood as the ability to disrupt, to disturb, and to reconfigure what is perceptible, sensible, and countable. Indeed, a wide range of political theorists, despite their often opposing views, share this search for renewing political thought in a post-foundational landscape that is characterized by inconsistency, radical heterogeneity, and incalculable immanence. It is from that perspective that Alain Badiou a few years back called ecology the new opium for the masses. Now that's quite a statement. A re-emergence of the political, he insists, resides in fidelity manifested in militant action to egalitarian political events that might open a political year procedure. Turning a politically progressive event into a political truth procedure requires the emergence of political subjects that maintain fidelity to the egalitarian event. It is a fidelity. I would argue that a few years back, Gezi Park, the Gezi Park revolts were a good illustration. Were they not about trees to begin with, but continue to be a deeply politicizing affair? It's a fidelity to the practical possibility of the common community, but without ultimate ontological guarantee in history, theory, technology, nature, ecology, the polity, or the state. Yet it is one that slowly and relentlessly carves out a new socio-physical and socio-ecological reality, often in the face of the most formidable repression and violence. And this requires sustained militant action, painstaking organization, and a lengthy process of radical egalitarian transformation. Above all, it necessitates abandoning the fear of failing, as failing we shall. So to conclude, the Urbicene and its symbolic framing is ultimately structured around ecologies of fear that nurture a reactionary stance and that urge techno-managerial forms of urban geosocial intervention. It is for me an expression of the current year process of post-De-politicization and the deepening of a post-democratic condition, one that is arranged around distinct immunological biopolitical gestures, and that are also revolve around the politics that makes life and makes death. The claim in this year's presentation about the Urbicene and how it works in no way suggests ignoring, let alone forgetting, the reality of non-human natures. The claim we make is about the urgent need to question the legitimacy of all manner of socio-environmental politics, policies, and interventions in the name of a thoroughly imagined and symbolized, symmetrical, more than human nature. That's a procedure that runs the danger of foreclosing a political frame through which such imaginaries become constituted and homogenized. It's one that disavows the constitutive split of the people and that silences constitutive antagonisms, particularly but not exclusively your class antagonisms. The argument proposed here urges us to accept the extraordinary variabilities of natures, insists on the need to make a wager on natures, that forces to choose politically between this rather than that nature. And it's one, most importantly, that takes sides of those who are made to die in order to make others live. To the extent that there is an earthly politics, it will have to be one that attests to the heterogeneities that cut through the social, that destabilize any community, that interrupts the existing order of the sensible, that subtracts from the immunological biopolitical frame, and that in doing so, proposes and works through forging new, egalitarian, human, non-human entanglements. I thank you very, very much for listening to my lecture on this Sunday afternoon. I'm now going to stop sharing my slides and perhaps we can have a further conversation.
Actually, we thank you very much for this thought-provoking presentation. Actually, people were kind of speechless listening to all these complex set of relations that you have presented. We have some questions, we have some comments, but it's now my task to kind of simply summarize what has been presented so we can talk about this global, urban, intellectual, and professional technocracy providing true urban planning, even providing us with certain techno-managerial dispositives and discourses, resilience, adaptation, and sustainability being among these discourses. And through these discourses, they're created winners and losers, of course, through this neoliberal capitalist urbanization process, So those who are made to die, ignored, forgotten, for instance, like the refugees, right? Or the ones to be saved, who's like the ones whose lives matter, right? So you suggest that we need a radical shift. So this was my summary. Now I have 3 questions. The first one on the overall general evaluation of the field, the second one on COVID, and the third one a little bit about the future. So, Burcu Yituran is asking, how could planning and design practices challenge the hegemony of depoliticizing epistemologies and narratives, while critical theory, pedagogy, and practice are constantly belittled and marginalized?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. That's a very good question to which I don't have an easy answer. Let me begin with the first task. That is, since critical theory, critical urban theory, is now almost hegemonic, certainly in the global North. I know very few of my colleagues or urban planners, practitioners, etc., who do not embrace critical theory. On the other hand, the critical theory that we are working with has often been completely depoliticized. So the first thing I would suggest is that we have to engage with critical political theory. And I would argue not enough of that is going on. So that although our critical theories, whether it's Marxist or post-colonial or feminist, post-structural, etc., I think what they claim to be politically performative. They have yet to demonstrate that they are politically performative. So I would argue that a much greater attention has to be paid to critical political thought. And I'm thinking here of people like Badiou, Zizek, Jacques Rancière, Jean-Luc Nancy, Chantal Mouffe, etc., who try to do exactly that. That's number one. Number two, we should try to ask ourselves why we keep on repeating these empty signifiers in our planning practice and theory, like sustainability, adaptation, resilience, you name it. It's hegemonic now. We should stop. We should refuse to use these kind of depoliticizing signifiers on the one hand, while on the other hand, also trying to understand why it is that we find these empty depoliticizing signifiers so attractive. And I would suggest that some of the contemporary psychoanalytic theorizations helps us to understand as to why it is that we enjoy so much the mobilization of a set of terms, technologies, and practices of which we know that they are politically empty and vacuous. So that's number two, to critically examine why we keep on repeating these hegemonic empty signifiers while we do know full well that they are empty signifiers. What is it that keeps us repeating these things? That's number two. And number three is very simple and technical. Much of the urban environmental practice that I see, of which there is some very, very good and interesting stuff. Don't misunderstand me. I think it's as important as anyone else that we should think about good technical sort of practices. What I do see is they are mostly territorial. Think of your climate change and the attempts to have carbon neutral technologies and forms of urban organization. I don't think that is good enough. What we need to have, technically speaking, in terms of data, is a flow-based model. A flow-based model. Let me give you a simple example of that. I am sitting in the city of Amsterdam. Amsterdam, like many other cities, wants to be carbon neutral by 2035. And they may succeed in a certain way if you look at Amsterdam as a localized island. My point is that Amsterdam is going to succeed by being carbon neutral, by exporting its carbon emissions to China or India or Africa. That is what is happening. And that is what I mean by this combined and uneven catastrophe. And it would not be too difficult to develop the methodological, data-driven analysis that does the whole flow model of our urban smart suggestions, etc. We should get out of the territorial trap, so to speak, and consider how what we do locally, however important it is always inserted in a process of combined and uneven socio-ecological development. And that's a technical choice.
Yeah. Also, in the first day of this colloquium, Roger Kyle had this question, how to operationalize a global urban governance. And
yes.
Like we have to all keep in mind this flow-based model, of course. Nonetheless, it's not easy to operationalize in the sense that I will ask the future question maybe now as a continuation of that. We kind of observe these technomanagerial discourses infusing within the critical academic circles or
yes.
communities of practice, right? Not
yes.
vice versa.
Yes.
So,
yes.
How to, and in the meantime, the mainstream discourses such as resilience, sustainability, adaptation are like available much more in the mass media with a much easier vocabulary, right?
Well,
so it's easier to understand, and also international institutions support these, so money behind.
Sure.
So how could we somehow enable emancipatory politics and make our critical understandings of these urbanization processes available to public? Because a couple of friends of mine were watching and they said they had difficulties kind of understanding, right? But it's we can understand each other because we are familiar with the concepts. However, how to make this available for general public so that they could adopt and internalize?
Sure. So 2 suggestions here. First, I think that in our urban planning theories, perspectives, and practices, we should be much more clearly taking sides in processes that we always know are unequal and contested. So what I find extremely interested in, what I'm most interested in, what are the experiments that are going on around the world that are trying to fight for the different socio-ecological politics? So I would very much encourage people to ally with such movements, whether it's the Taksim Square, configuration was a classic example of that. But you would find it too with the Indignados in Spain or with indigenous movement in Latin America. It's extraordinary how much creative energy is being used and mobilized in a variety of ways. Nonetheless, we do not tend to spend too much attention to that. It's a very marginal part of what we urban planners and theorists do. The second thing is, yes, of course, to establish hegemonic signifiers is difficult. We all know that is difficult. We all know that signifiers like sustainability, adaptation, resilience, and what have you, are widely shared by both the political, the economic, as well as the scientific elite. So changing that is extremely difficult and it's not going to happen overnight. But what we should dare to use is to use politicizing signifiers. Politicizing signifiers, like for example, equality. Everyone understands equality. No one uses it any longer, or not many people are using it these days. They talk about justice. Now, I leave justice to George Bush and the elites. They talk about justice. Let's talk about equality again. What does it mean to have an equal city? How do you constitute that? And equality is not such a complicated signifier. I think anyone would understand a signifier like equality, which would simultaneously open up a discussion. You know, it means that some people are more equal than others. Secondly, we also have to dare to use politicizing signifiers. I mean, as we know, and as most of us would agree, that sustainability, resilience, adaptation, or depoliticizing signifiers, they have no political content. Why do we not begin to use again the politicizing signifiers? And there are not that many. You have democracy, socialism, communism, capitalism, liberalism. No, these are politicizing signifiers. Let's use them. What kind of political signifiers do we want to rally around? So that's my second point. The third point is that we, and I think that is perhaps for people who are academics or intellectuals, etc., the most important thing is to shift the terrain upon which the whole fantasy is constituted. And for me, the socio-ecological problematic is founded upon two assumptions. The first assumption is that if we don't do anything now, catastrophe will come. That's assumption number one, right? If we don't do anything, climate change will wreck the world. So it's a promise of a catastrophe to come, which has to be avoided. That's assumption number one. The second assumption then is that we have to intervene in that to save humanity. Yeah, it's in the name of saving the future of humanity that we have to avoid this catastrophe. Now, what if both of those assumptions are wrong? What if we start from the assumption that the catastrophe has already happened in a highly uneven sort of way? And not for me and not for you, but for many people are already living in the socio-ecological catastrophe. Yeah. So if we start from the actually existing combined and uneven catastrophe, you open up immediately this question of socio-ecological inequality, not some sort of future that has to be avoided, but some sort of actually existing reality which is now continuously disavowed. So we have to turn that around. And the second assumption, we have to turn around too. There is no humanity to be preserved. There has never been a humanity. There are pockets of people who are politically fighting for the making of humanity. Yes, humanity is a process of its making. It's not that we have it now. There is no humanity to be preserved if I look at the combined and uneven catastrophe that is happening. So I think we have an important task to reorganize the fantasy upon which we legitimize our interventions. And these two strike me as vital. Humanity does not exist. We can just hope to make one, and the catastrophe is not going to come. It is already too late. If you combine these two, what do we do? What kind of techno-managerial interventions do we mobilize if we start on these two assumptions? So these are the kind of things that planners might want to think about. You know? Yeah.
So a follow-up question. So how about the Green New Deal? So we're also talking about this global Green New Deal because you refer to experimentation in different parts of the world, and Green New Deal is now emergent in many countries.
Yes, it is.
And it's quite valuable for critical academic circles, but also is discussed at the level of EU.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Governing, etc. How do you evaluate? Does it hold potentials for change? What do you think?
I mean, first off, I do welcome the discussions over the Green New Deal. It is certainly better that we have them than not having them. So in that sense, I am not against them. However, secondly, if I look at the critical literature, much of it is very critical, and quite rightly so, of the way in which the new Green Deal is staged. But I'm getting really bored with this critical analysis of the Green New Deal. I know that. We all know that. We all know that. Everyone who knows about critical theory does not need to have an other article about the critique of the Green New Deal. Thirdly, yeah. Thirdly, what we do need is what sort of Green New Deal do we want? A, yeah. And B, how does that differ from the dominant idea of the Green New Deal, which is basically, and that is fully acknowledged by most agents who are active in it, that it wants to combine continuous capital accumulation, economic growth, and saving the planet. Now, I would argue that you cannot save the mad dance of capitalism, as David Harvey would call it, accumulation for accumulation's sake, and save the ecological as well, ecological basis as well as social equality. Cannot combine, you know. So a Green New Deal that is still deeply inserted in the mad dance of economic growth, capital accumulation, is of necessity bound to fail in terms of providing what we would like to see, that is an ecologically more sensible world that is simultaneously more democratic and socially inclusive. That cannot be done. And we know that. And we know that. We know that. Yeah. We've known that for a long time. So these are the kind of things that it cannot be done. Even if I wished it would be possible. I'd love to see it happen. Cannot be done. So we need something else in its stead. Yeah, that is ecologically sensible and democratic, inclusive, politically speaking, as well as socially equitable.
Okay, thank you very much. Last question. Sorry to Efe Cengiz, I had to ask all these follow-up questions.
Very fine.
So with the COVID,
yeah.
Efe Cengiz says, when we consider the initial lockdown period,
yeah.
could the martyrization of the medical workers and essentialization of some workers be considered as a thanatopolitics, politics of death,
politics of death.
Of the pandemic?
Yeah.
And if not, where should we locate the politics of death,
yes.
of this?
Yeah, death. No. I
yeah.
actually think, I hadn't thought about this before, but in many, many ways, that's exactly what it is, right? If I look at the frontline workers in the COVID-19 pandemic, that includes not just people in the medical services, but also those who keep the logistics of everyday life going, who keep sure that the food is in my shop, that deliver my mail or my packages on the doorstep. And these are the frontline workers that keep everyday urban life going. Yeah? They are the ones who run the overwhelming risk of getting infected and consequently run the overwhelming risk of suffering the worst negative consequences. My risk is virtually zero. I live in Amsterdam, locked down. I go out once a day to do my shopping. Most of my stuff comes by day workers who deliver stuff. So they die in order for me to live. It's a beautiful example which can be empirically perfectly demonstrated and illustrated. If I look at the UK, if you come from an ethnic minority background, you have 4 times more chance of dying, risk of dying, than if you're white middle class or up 4 times. No? No, this is about making life and making death. And COVID is indeed a very good illustration of that. Moreover, it is precisely those who are at the front line who are making my urban life sustainable under these very difficult circumstances, who are at the lowest paid, lowest income part of the population. Most of them, not all of them. Doctors, of course, are fine, but nurses, the cleaners, etc., who keep our hospitals going, who keep social services going, etc., are usually not the highest paid members of society. What they do bring out, of course, is that it is these kind of people who keep the socio-ecological metabolism sustainable while things go on. No one gives a toss any longer about the stock market, how the financial capitalists are doing, etc. No one cares about this any longer. No one cares any longer about state deficits. No one cares any longer about the neoliberal cookbook. That's out of the window now. So it does tell, COVID does demonstrate to us what the reality of the situation is. Yes. Whether that will consequently have an effect on a post-COVID urban theory, planning and practice remains to be seen, but it's certainly something worth fighting for. I wrote a little piece a few weeks ago that I titled "In Defense of the COVID Economy," but without the virus. So there are actually quite amazing things visible and seeable within the everyday practices, urban practices of the COVID pandemic, which I for one, would like to see continued after we've managed this monster on our footsteps. But which is demonstrating to us that things can be done differently. You know, Amsterdam is wonderful for people like me. Amsterdam is wonderful now. No tourists. Yeah, normally 12 million tourists in Amsterdam. It's a nightmare. It's fantastic now. I walk the cities of Amsterdam, city of Amsterdam as if it is a village. It's wonderful. It's fantastic. Anyway.
So, Professor Swyngedouw, thank you very, very much. We are over our time. We would like to thank our translators again.
Yes,
it was a great discussion. Yeah, and I also would like to thank my chamber for giving me this opportunity to discuss urbanization questions with you in this very Zoom room. So thank you again for being here.
It was a pleasure of being here, of joining you on this Sunday afternoon. I would also like to express my thanks and gratitude to the translators. It is an almost impossible, if not extremely, at least a very difficult job to do what they had to do. Thank you very, very much for doing this on a Sunday afternoon. And to everyone who was there, thank you very much for listening. And I hope that we will meet again in not too distant a future, face to face.
Oh, hopefully. Yes. And our audience, we are very, very crowded. Stay tuned, because at 8:30 we have Stavros Stavridis, the last keynote speech of our colloquium. So thank you, everyone, and see you next year.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.
Bye.
Bye-bye.